The world outside the stagecoach window was too big. That was Elara Vance's first and most persistent thought. It was a landscape that did not care for the smallness of a woman's hopes. The wheels of the coach groaned and jolted over a trail that was little more than a pair of ruts carved into the hide of the Montana Territory, a land of bone-deep silence and immense, empty distances. The sky, which had been a pale, washed-out blue for most of the morning, was now gathering a bruise on its western edge, a heavy line of gray that was slowly thickening, swallowing the light. Pine-choked mountains clawed at the horizon, their peaks old and jagged against the sky. They stood like silent judges, their shadows stretching long and skeletal across the valley floor. The wind, a constant, whining presence, slipped through the cracks in the coach and carried with it the scent of dust, dry grass, and something else, a clean, sharp coldness that spoke of distant snow. Elara pulled her thin wool shawl tighter around her shoulders, the gesture doing little to ward off the chill that had settled deep in her marrow. She was not here for adventure. She was a refugee, and this vast, uncaring wilderness was her last port in a storm. Her fingers, tucked inside a worn leather reticule, found the folded edges of a letter. She did not need to read it. She had memorized every word, every carefully formed promise of a new life. Mr. Alistair Thompson. His name felt foreign on her tongue, the name of a man she knew only through the confident slant of his handwriting. He was, according to his letters and the brisk correspondence with the bridal agency, the leading citizen of a town called Redemption Gulch, a man of means and respectability, a man who needed a wife to manage his home and stand by his side, a man offering salvation. Salvation was what she needed. Her mind, as it so often did in these quiet, rattling moments, drifted back to Ohio, to the smell of smoke. It was a scent she would never be free of. One night, a fire had bloomed in the darkness, a hungry orange flower that consumed her world. It had taken her parents, her brother, the small clapboard house that held every memory she owned, and in its wake, it had left whispers. The whispers had started as embers, glowing in the dark corners of the town, fanned by suspicion and grief. Elara had argued with her father that evening, a simple disagreement about money, about her future, but in the telling and retelling, it became a motive. The whispers said she was careless. The whispers said she was resentful. The whispers hinted at something darker, something monstrous, that a daughter could be somehow responsible for the inferno that left her the sole survivor. The accusations were never spoken to her face. Of course, they were looks that skittered away when she met them, conversations that died when she entered a room, the sudden, chilling isolation that was more damning than any spoken verdict. She was left with nothing but a small satchel, a few dollars, and a reputation charred beyond repair. So she had run. She had answered an advertisement, presented the most respectable version of herself she could muster, and agreed to marry a stranger 1,000 miles away. The promises in Mr. Thompson's letter of a fine house, of a respected position in a new community, of stability, felt as flimsy and fragile as dried leaves against the raw, absolute power of the land around her. The stagecoach finally lurched to a halt, its weary creaking a sound of profound finality. Elara peered out the window. The outpost was not a town, not even a village. It was a single, rickety depot with a sagging porch roof and a long, low stable next to it, looking as though it were barely holding on against the ceaseless wind. The horses blew and stamped in the traces, their breath pluming in the cooling air. The door was pulled open by the driver, a grizzled man with tobacco stains in his beard. "End of the line, ma'am," he grunted, not quite meeting her eyes. Elara gathered her satchel and her courage, stepping down onto the hard-packed dirt. The air was thin and bit at her lungs. She looked around, smoothing the wrinkles from her gray traveling dress. There was no sign of a well-dressed town leader, no welcoming party, no Mr. Thompson. Instead, a man waited. He was not on the porch, but leaning against one of its main support beams, as if he himself were a part of the structure, holding it up through sheer force of will. He was tall, and the breadth of his shoulders strained the seams of his worn buckskin shirt. His legs, encased in scuffed leather trousers, were long and powerful. He was built like the mountains that surrounded them, all hard lines and unyielding presence. But it was his face that stole her breath and replaced it with a knot of ice. One side of his face, from the temple down his cheek and disappearing into the collar of his shirt, was a ruin. The skin was a taut, discolored landscape of old burns, pulling the corner of his eye and his mouth into a permanent, grim cast. The scars were not red and angry, but pale and silvery, like the underside of a leaf, a testament to a long-ago agony. Amidst that ruin, his eyes were a startling, piercing gray, as clear and cold as a winter sky. They were watchful, missing nothing, and they held no warmth at all. He pushed himself off the beam with a slow, deliberate movement. Every line of his body spoke of a coiled stillness, a quiet danger. He walked toward her, his footsteps making no sound in the dust. The stagecoach driver and the station master, who had emerged from the depot, suddenly found things to do. Their backs turned, their movements hurried and unnatural. They would not look at him. "You, Ilara Vance?" His voice was a low, rough sound, like rocks grinding together at the bottom of a river. Ilara swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She nodded, unable to speak. "Heard the coach was in," the man continued, his cold gaze sweeping over her, taking in her city-made clothes and her palpable fear. "I'm Caleb Blackwood. Thompson paid me to fetch you." Fetch her, like a parcel or a stray calf. There was no greeting, no hint of welcome, only a flat statement of weary obligation. The air between them crackled with a tension so thick she could taste it. This was not what she had expected. This silent, scarred man was a creature of the wilderness she had just been rattling through, not a representative of the respectable society she had been promised. Fear, sharp and acidic, rose in her throat, and she fought to push it down. She had come too far to be undone by fear now. The journey to Redemption Gulch began not in a comfortable buggy, but on the back of a sturdy roan mare. Her trunk, her last connection to her old life, was strapped securely to a pack mule that trailed behind them. Caleb Blackwood rode ahead on a powerful black gelding, his back a rigid, uncommunicative wall. The silence was a living thing. It pressed in on Ilara from all sides, heavier than the sky, deeper than the valleys. The only sounds were the rhythmic plodding of the horse's hooves on the rocky trail, the creak of saddle leather, and the rising moan of the wind as it funneled through the pines. He did not speak, did not look back to see if she was keeping up. He simply moved forward with a brutal efficiency that she found both terrifying and, in a strange way, reassuring. This man, whatever else he was, knew this land. He belonged here in a way she never could. Ilara, raised on the civilities and small pleasantries of the East, found his silence to be a kind of assault. It was a deliberate withholding, a wall built to keep her out. After nearly an hour of listening to the wind and the pounding of her own heart, she could bear it no longer. "Is Redemption Gulch much farther?" she asked, her voice sounding small and thin in the vast emptiness. He did not turn his head. For a moment, she thought he had not heard her, or was simply choosing to ignore her. Then, his answer came, clipped and short. "Some ways." She tried again, a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm between them. "Mr. Thompson wrote that it is a prosperous town." "It's a town," he said, and the words were devoid of any inflection that might suggest prosperity or its lack. "And Mr. Thompson, is he well regarded?" This time, a slight pause. He shifted in his saddle, a small movement that seemed weighted with meaning. "He owns most of it." The words were simple enough, but the tone beneath them was dark and bitter. A cold undercurrent she could not decipher. It was a warning, perhaps, but of what? She did not know. She fell silent again, chastened. She understood then that this man would offer no comfort, no conversation. She was merely cargo he was paid to transport. They climbed higher, leaving the rolling plains behind for the rugged embrace of the foothills. The trail narrowed, twisting through stands of ancient pine and around massive outcrops of gray granite. The world grew wilder, more elemental, and colder. The wind was no longer just a sound. It now had teeth. It bit at her exposed cheeks and found its way through the seams of her coat. A garment that had seemed so practical and warm in the shops of Cincinnati, but was proving to be a foolish, flimsy defense against the Montana chill. The gray line on the horizon had advanced, consuming the pale blue sky until the entire world was capped by a lid of bruised, churning cloud. Then, the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were not the soft, feathery flakes of her memory, but hard, tiny pellets of ice, stinging her face like needles. Caleb Blackwood's entire demeanor changed. The detached, stony silence was replaced by a taut, focused urgency. He spurred his horse to a faster pace, his head constantly moving, his gaze sweeping the jagged ridgelines, the darkening sky, the path ahead. The change in him was more frightening than the storm itself. His calm detachment had been unnerving. His tense alertness was terrifying. It told her that this was no mere flurry. This was something to be feared. "Keep up," he called back to her, his voice sharp, cutting through the wind. Elara urged her horse on, her hands clumsy and numb on the reins. The cold was a physical pain now, a deep ache that settled into her bones. The mare, sensing the urgency of its master, needed little encouragement, but Elara struggled to stay seated, her body stiff and uncooperative. Panic began to flutter in her chest, a frantic bird beating its wings against her ribs. She had never felt a cold like this, never seen a sky so menacing. This was a different kind of nature, one without mercy. The blizzard did not arrive. It fell upon them like a collapsing wall. One moment, they were riding through stinging sleet. The next, the world was gone, erased by a churning, roaring vortex of white. Visibility dropped to nothing. The wind shrieked, a high, hungry sound like a starving animal, and the temperature plummeted as if a door to a cellar of ice had been thrown open. The snow was no longer falling. It was driving horizontally, a blinding sheet of white that scoured the air. Elara cried out, a sound snatched away by the gale. Her horse shied, turning in a confused circle. A large, dark shape materialized beside her. It was Caleb, dismounted, his face nearly invisible behind a swirl of snow. He grabbed the reins of her horse, his grip firm and sure. "Can't make it to town," he bellowed, his voice barely audible over the storm's fury. "Have to find shelter. Stay close." The raw fear in her heart solidified into a cold, hard knot. This was it. This was how her desperate flight would end. Not with a new life, but with a frozen death on a nameless mountainside. Alone with a scarred, silent stranger. The depot master's nervous whispers about Blackwood came back to her. How he lived apart from the town. How he was a man best left alone. She thought of the fire that had consumed her home. The suffocating heat, the choking smoke. A chilling, terrible irony washed over her. She had fled a world of flame only to die in a world of ice. Caleb forged ahead, a phantom leading her through the white chaos. He seemed to be navigating by some internal compass, his head down, his broad shoulders squared against the punishing wind. Elara could do nothing but hold on to the saddle horn and trust him, a man she had every reason to fear. The minutes stretched into an eternity of blinding snow and screaming wind. Her limbs were numb, her thoughts sluggish. Just as she felt her grip begin to fail, Caleb stopped. He loomed over her, a dark shape against the swirling white. Through the maelstrom, she could just make out another, darker shape behind him, a low, solid silhouette. A cabin. It was a primitive, sturdy structure, built of thick, formidable logs, chinked with dark mud against the wind. It was nestled in a small clearing, banked against a sheer rock face that offered it some protection from the storm's direct assault. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, a bastion built for the sole purpose of surviving the rage of the wilderness. Caleb's hands were on her waist, helping her from the saddle. Her legs would not cooperate. They were stiff, useless things. She nearly fell, but he held her up, his strength absolute. He half carried, half dragged her to the heavy wooden door and pushed it open. The inside was a wall of darkness and frigid, still air. He guided her in and then disappeared back into the storm. She heard the sounds of him leading the horses away, presumably to some attached shelter. Elara stood shivering in the gloom, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. As her eyes adjusted, she began to make out the details of her prison. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace that was black and cold. The space was starkly masculine, stripped of any comfort or softness. A rough-hewn table stood in the center with a single, straight-backed chair. Against one wall, a bed was built into the logs, a simple platform with a pile of furs thrown over it. Shelves on the opposite wall held basic supplies in tins and sacks. The air smelled of old wood smoke, tanned leather, and something else she could not quite name, a lingering scent of profound solitude, of a grief so old it had become part of the wood and stone. Caleb returned, slamming the door against the storm and sliding a thick wooden bar into place. Snow covered his shoulders and hair. He moved with a practiced, economical power, his body wasting no motion. He brought in armfuls of firewood from a stack by the door, knelt at the hearth, and with a flint and steel, began to coax a flame to life. He worked in complete silence. Elara, shivering uncontrollably, could only huddle on the floor near the nascent flames, feeling small, useless, and utterly out of her element. She was intensely aware of him, of his size in the small cabin, of the way the first flickering firelight danced over the scarred landscape of his face, making the shadows deeper, the ridges of skin more pronounced. He was a creature of this harsh place, and she was a fragile thing blown far from her proper soil. The fire caught, and a small circle of warmth began to push back the bone-deep cold. Caleb rose and moved to a small stove in the corner. Soon the smell of coffee filled the small space, a bitter, earthy aroma that was somehow comforting. He poured the steaming liquid into a tin cup and held it out to her. He still had not spoken a word. She took it, her trembling hands making the cup rattle. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a curt nod in response and turned back to the fire. She drank the hot, bitter coffee, the warmth a small mercy that spread slowly through her chest. An invisible wall stood between them, built of fear and social convention, of her polite Eastern upbringing and his savage, silent world. They were two people from different species, trapped in the same cage. When he attended to the fire and was satisfied with its blaze, he gestured with his head toward the built-in bed. "Take it," he said. It was an order, not an offer. He took the remaining furs and made a bed for himself on the rough floorboards near the hearth, as far from her as the small room would allow. He lay down with his back to her, a clear and final dismissal. Elara retreated to the bed, not bothering to remove her damp dress. She crawled under the heavy weight of the furs, which smelled of him, of leather and cold air and pine smoke. She lay awake for hours, her body rigid with tension, listening to the two sounds that filled her new world, the relentless, deafening rage of the storm outside, and the slow, steady breathing of the stranger on the floor. She had run from the ghosts of her past only to be trapped by the terrifying reality of the present. She was locked in a cage of snow and stone with a man whose soul, she suspected, was just as scarred and ruined as his face. The second day was born into a world that had not changed. only worsened. Alara woke slowly, drawn from a heavy, dreamless sleep not by light, but by sound and smell. The sound was the ceaseless, tormented roar of the wind, a noise that had worked its way into the very fabric of the cabin. The small building groaned under the assault, its thick logs complaining like the timbers of a ship in a hurricane. Outside the single, grime-streaked window, there was no sky, no ground, no trees, only an undifferentiated, churning whiteness. The storm had not passed. It had settled in, intensifying its siege. The smell was of coffee and sizzling bacon, a scent so domestic and comforting it felt entirely out of place in their primitive fortress. She pushed herself up on her elbows. Caleb was already awake, his broad back to her as he tended to the fire in the hearth. The flames cast a warm, golden glow that pushed back the gray gloom, creating a small island of life in the vast, deadening white. The cabin, which had seemed merely small the night before, now felt constricting. The forced proximity was the central, undeniable fact of their existence. Every scrape of a boot on the floorboards, every rustle of clothing, every breath drawn was magnified in the enclosed space. She was aware of his presence in a way that was primal and absolute. He must have heard her stir. Without turning, he used a long fork to lift 2 strips of crisp bacon from a skillet and lay them on a tin plate next to a piece of hardtack biscuit. He placed the plate on the rough-hewn table. It was not an invitation, but a simple statement of fact. Food was ready. The gesture, devoid of any ceremony, was nevertheless a form of communication, a truce offered in their silent standoff. She swung her legs out of the warm bed, the cold floorboards a shock to her bare feet. She smoothed her wrinkled dress, feeling disheveled and out of place. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around the warm tin plate. "Thank you," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. He gave a slight nod, his attention still on the fire. He ate his own portion standing by the hearth. A habit, she guessed, born of years of solitude. They began to talk, not with the easy flow of pleasantries, but with the clipped, functional language of necessity. The conversation was about survival. "We need to be careful with the wood," he said, his gaze fixed on the dwindling pile he'd brought in the night before. "And the food." "How long do you think?" she began, trailing off as she gestured vaguely toward the roaring world outside the window. "It's a norther," he said, his voice the same low, gravelly rumble. But she was beginning to hear nuances in it now. Beneath the roughness, there was a deep, resonant weariness, the sound of a man who had seen too many winters. Could be 2 more days, could be a week. You can't reason with it. You just have to outlast it. He spoke of the storm as if it were a living entity, an ancient and malevolent god. His words held a profound, fatalistic knowledge of the unforgiving nature of this land. He finally turned to look at her, his clear gray eyes holding hers for the first time. The scarred side of his face was thrown into shadow, the other side illuminated by the fire, making him seem like 2 different men. "Why did you come out here?" he asked. The question was not idle. It was direct, cutting straight through the layers of formality that she usually wrapped herself in. It demanded an honest answer. She looked down at her plate, pushing a crumb of biscuit with her finger. She could not tell him the whole truth. Not yet. The shame of it was still too raw, a fresh burn on her soul. "My family. There was a fire. I lost them," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "There was nothing left for me back in Ohio. I needed a new start." It was the truth, but a carefully edited version of it. She left out the accusing eyes, the whispers that followed her like stray dogs, the suffocating weight of a town that had already judged and condemned her. Caleb listened, his expression unreadable. His silence was not empty. It was attentive. She felt his focus on her, dissecting her words. He did not offer the soft, useless platitudes she had come to expect and despise. He did not say, "I am so sorry for your loss." He simply watched her for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not pity. It was a silent acknowledgement of hardship, a gesture from one survivor to another that said, "I have seen the world burn, too." She was immensely grateful for it. The hours crept by. Measured in the logs added to the fire and the cups of coffee they drank, the monotony of their confinement was broken by a sudden, violent crack from outside, a sound like a pistol shot that made Alara jump. It was followed by a splintering groan. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, his body tense. "The lean-to," he said, already pulling on his heavy coat and hat. "The snow load, the roof beam is giving way." The thought of the horses, their only way out of this wilderness, trapped or injured, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Caleb was heading for the door, preparing to venture out into that maelstrom alone. "I will help you," she said, standing up. It was not a request. He stopped and looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "No, you will stay here. You would not last 5 minutes out there." "I will not be a helpless burden," she insisted, her chin lifting. "I will not sit here by the fire while you risk your life for my passage. You need another pair of hands." She saw the stubborn set of his jaw, but her own was just as firm. She had been useless for too long, a passive victim of fate. That part of her, she decided, had died somewhere on the trail yesterday. He stared at her, his gray eyes narrowed, and for a moment she thought he would physically restrain her, but then he saw the iron resolve in her face. With a grunt of reluctant surrender, he turned and pulled a massive, heavy fur coat from a peg on the wall. It was made of buffalo hide, and it smelled of the cold and the wild. "Put this on," he ordered. He wrapped it around her. It was so large it was like being swallowed by a bear. He then grabbed a coil of rope from a hook. "And you will not move one step without this." He tied one end securely around her waist and looped the other around the thick iron handle of the cabin door. "If you let go of my hand, you follow the rope back. Do you understand?" She nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was not being cruel, he was being practical. The world outside was a place where one could get lost and die within 10 feet of safety. The moment he opened the door, the storm lunged at them. The force of the wind was a solid, physical blow that staggered her and stole the breath from her lungs. The cold was a violation, an excruciating pain that felt like fire on her exposed skin. The world was a screaming, featureless void of white. Caleb grabbed her hand, his grip like a vice, and pulled her forward into the blizzard. They fought their way to the lean-to, a 3-sided structure built against the side of the cabin. A thick, heavy roof beam had cracked clean through, sagging dangerously under a mountain of snow. The horses, their eyes wide with fear, shuffled nervously below it. Working together was a chaotic battle against the elements. They could not speak, only shout single words that were immediately ripped away by the gale. "Push! Now! Hold it!" He managed to wedge a spare log under the broken beam as a temporary support, and she used a shovel he thrust into her hands to frantically clear away the crushing weight of the snow. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, and her fingers, even inside her gloves, were numb, useless claws. At one point, her foot slipped, and the wind caught her, nearly tearing her from his grasp. His arm shot out, pulling her back against his solid frame. For a second, they stood pressed together, 2 small, defiant figures against the apocalypse, and she felt the steady, powerful beat of his heart through the layers of their clothes. It was the most alive thing in the world. Somehow, they managed to brace the beam enough to make it hold. They stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door and collapsing against it, gasping for breath. They were covered head to toe in snow, their hair and eyebrows crusted with ice. The sudden silence and warmth of the room were dizzying. Ilara's body trembled with cold and exertion, but a strange, fierce exhilaration sang in her blood. They had faced the storm together, and they had won. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. A significant barrier between them, more formidable than any social convention, had been broken. Later that evening, the exhaustion settled in. They sat by the fire, the furs from the bed wrapped around their shoulders. The shared danger had leveled the ground between them, stripping away the roles of mail-order bride and hired guide. They were simply a man and a woman who had kept each other alive. Ilara shivered, a deep, bone-rattling chill that had little to do with the cold. Caleb noticed. He reached over, wordlessly taking the heavy fur from his own shoulders and draping it over hers, tucking it in around her. The gesture was impersonal, as practical as shoring up a roof beam. But in the close confines of the fire-lit cabin, it felt deeply, shockingly intimate. The weight of it was comforting, and it carried his scent of wood smoke and winter. The silence that fell was different now. It was no longer a tense, empty void, but a quiet space that held the potential for words. Feeling a strange sense of safety she could not explain, cocooned in this isolated place, she finally asked the question that had been lurking in her mind since she first saw him. "Your scars," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "How did it happen?" She expected him to retreat, to raise that wall of silence between them again. She expected a brusque dismissal. Instead, he stared into the crackling flames, his profile a study in stone and sorrow. The firelight played over the ruined side of his face, making the pale skin gleam. A long time passed. The only sounds were the fire and the wind. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, scraped clean of all emotion. "A fire." Her breath caught in her throat. Of all the things he could have said, that was the one she was least prepared for. His hands, resting on his knees, slowly clenched into white-knuckled fists. "I lost everything," he continued, his gaze still locked on the flames, as if he were seeing something else in their depths. "My house, the ranch, my wife, and my boy." The admission hung in the air between them, a thing of impossible weight. A wife, a son. The stark, masculine cabin was suddenly filled with their ghosts. The lingering scent of solitude she had noticed was not just solitude. It was grief. A grief so profound it had become a permanent part of the atmosphere. A terrible, aching empathy swelled in her chest, so powerful it felt like her own pain. His reclusiveness, his bitterness, the wary coldness in his eyes, it all clicked into place. He was not just a scarred man. He was a man who had been hollowed out, a walking ruin haunted by the life that had been stolen from him. His vulnerability was a door left unexpectedly ajar, moved by a powerful impulse to meet his honesty with her own. Ilara found herself speaking, the words pouring out of her before she could stop them. She told him the true story of her own fire. "The people in my town, they whispered," she confessed, the shame making her voice tremble. "They said I was to blame for the fire that killed my family, that I was careless. I had argued with my father that day. They said I was angry with him. The guilt and humiliation she had carried for 1,000 miles, a secret, toxic burden, spilled out into the warm air of the cabin. The whispers followed me everywhere. I couldn't escape them. It was in their eyes when they looked at me. I became something unclean. It was impossible to stay." In that moment, they were no longer Mr. Blackwood and Miss Vance. They were no longer a stranger and a mail-order bride. They were two survivors, two people branded by the same element, each finding a terrible, clarifying mirror for their own pain in the other's eyes. Caleb turned his head from the fire and looked at her. His gray eyes were clear, and for the first time, she saw not coldness, but a deep, knowing sorrow. He did not say the empty words. "I'm sorry." He said something else, something that meant more than any expression of pity ever could. "People believe what's easy," he said, his voice low and rough. And with those 4 words, a year of shame and isolation began to fall away from her. It was the most profoundly understanding thing anyone had said to her. He did not question her. He did not doubt her. He simply understood the casual, thoughtless cruelty of the world. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted, the last of the tension dissolving like smoke. In its place grew a fragile, tentative intimacy. They began to share other stories, small pieces of the lives they had lived before the fires. She told him about her mother's garden in Ohio, about the rows of peonies and the scent of lavender on summer evenings. He told her about breaking his first horse, a wild buckskin Mustang, a battle of wills that had ended in a grudging, mutual respect. They discovered small things about each other. He had a dry, unexpected sense of humor that appeared in brief, wry comments. He was coming to see, possessed a quiet, resilient strength that he had not expected from an Eastern woman in a fancy dress. The physical awareness between them, which had been a source of fear and tension, was now charged with this new emotional connection. It became a low, humming current in the air. She found herself noticing the way his hands, though calloused and rough from work, were surprisingly gentle when he stoked the fire or sharpened a knife. He found himself watching the way she bit her lower lip when she was lost in thought, or the way a few stray strands of auburn hair had escaped her braid to curl against the nape of her neck. The desire that was growing between them was unspoken, but it was as real and palpable as the warmth from the hearth. The turning point came in the deep hours of the night, in a darkness punctuated by the howl of the wind. Elara woke with a strangled gasp, her body thrashing, her lungs aching for air. She was back in Ohio, trapped in her room, the air thick with black smoke, the heat blistering her skin. "Hey!" The voice was low, right beside her. Caleb was there, a dark shape kneeling by her bed. He had moved from his spot on the floor with a silence that was startling. He did not touch her, but his presence was a solid, calming anchor in the terrifying aftermath of the dream. Her heart was still hammering, but the smoke in her lungs began to clear. "Just a dream," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. He stayed there until her breathing evened out, then retreated to his furs on the floor. A few hours later, in the dim fading light of the dying fire, a sound tore through the cabin's quiet. It was a raw, agonized cry, ripped from a place of unimaginable pain. It was Caleb. Elara sat bolt upright. He was caught in his own nightmare, his body rigid on the floor, his hands clenched. She slipped from the bed, her bare feet silent on the cold wood. Hesitantly, she knelt beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. He jolted awake with a violent shudder, his gray eyes flying open, wild with remembered horror. He stared up at her, his breathing ragged, his face slick with sweat despite the cabin's chill. He looked at her hand on his shoulder, but he did not pull away. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the near darkness, the embers of the fire casting a faint red glow. Her hand remained on his shoulder. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with everything they had told each other, with a shared, unspoken understanding of loss, of grief, of survival. Finally, the tension eased from his body, and he lay back down, his breathing still unsteady. Elara did not move away immediately. She stayed there, a silent guardian against the ghosts that haunted the small cabin. In that quiet, heavy moment, the desire that had been simmering between them all day crested, becoming an undeniable, physical ache. It was not a simple, fleeting lust. It was a deep, soul-crushing need to find comfort in another human being, to feel something other than the cold weight of grief, to be seen and accepted, scars and all. As if he could read her thoughts, he reached out, his calloused fingers, hesitant and gentle, grazed the skin of her wrist. It was a touch that was both a question and a silent plea. Stay. It was a silent promise of shared solace in the long, dark night. On what they guessed was the 4th or 5th day, the world began to change. The change was not in the landscape, which remained an unbroken, impossible wilderness of white, but in the sound, the incessant, violent howling of the wind, which had been the soundtrack to their confinement, began to soften. It gentled from a roar to a shriek, from a shriek to a mournful sigh that whispered around the corners of the cabin instead of trying to tear it from its foundations. Through the grime on the single window pane, a weak, diluted light began to seep, pushing back the perpetual gray twilight they had lived in, the world outside. For so long a churning chaos was now still. It was blanketed in a layer of snow so deep and pure it seemed the earth itself had been born anew. The silence that fell was as profound and absolute as the storm's noise had been. It was a heavy, listening silence, thick with the weight of unspoken things. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had grown heavy. Too, the fragile intimacy they had forged through shared stories and nightmares had ripened into an almost unbearable physical tension. They moved around each other in the small space with a new, careful grace. Every accidental brush of his arm against hers as they passed. Every time their eyes met across the rough-hewn table, the air crackled with a palpable energy. They were no longer just a man and a woman trapped by a storm. They were Caleb and Alara, two souls who had seen the deepest wounds in the other and had not looked away. This shared knowledge had created a bond so powerful it vibrated in the air between them, a low, constant hum of awareness. The silence eventually became too much to bear. Caleb pushed himself up from the table, the legs of the chair scraping against the floorboards, the sound unnaturally loud. "The wind's let up," he stated, his voice rough. "I need to check on the horses properly, start digging us out." The mundane task was a necessary fiction, a pretense of normalcy that they both desperately needed. It was an excuse to put distance between them, to escape the suffocating intensity that had filled the cabin. Alara nodded, her eyes fixed on the fire. "Be careful." She stood in the open doorway, the cold, clean air a shock to her lungs, and watched him work. He moved with a powerful, relentless rhythm, his broad shoulders straining as he shoveled a path through the massive snowdrifts that had buried the lean-to. The sun was a pale, watery disk in the sky, but its light was enough to set the snow-covered world ablaze with a million glittering points of diamond dust. The scene was one of stark, breathtaking beauty. The mountains, robed in white, looked serene and majestic rather than menacing. The world felt scrubbed clean, a fresh page waiting for a new story to be written. As she watched him, a single, startling realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. She did not want to leave. The thought of Redemption Gulch, of the respectable Mr. Alistair Thompson, of the life she had traveled 1,000 miles to claim, now filled her with a cold, hollow dread that had nothing to do with the weather. This small, rough cabin, a place that should have been her prison, had instead become a sanctuary. And this scarred, silent, grieving man, a man she should have feared, had become her anchor in a world that had tried to drown her. He was gone for a long time. When he finally returned, stamping the thick snow from his boots, his face was raw from the cold and his breath came in white plumes. Alara had a tin cup of hot coffee waiting for him. He took it with a grateful nod, his frozen fingers wrapping around its warmth. He stood with his back to her, close to the fire, letting the heat seep into his chilled bones. He began to strip off his wet outer layers, first the heavy fur coat, then a damp wool shirt beneath it. With his back to her, the firelight cast his torso in sharp relief, and she had seen the scars on his face and neck, but they were only a preface to the story written across his back, from his powerful shoulders down to his waist. His skin was a terrifying roadmap of his past pain, a landscape of pale, silvery tissue, interwoven with darker, puckered patches of skin that drew the muscles taut. It was a testament to an agony she could barely imagine, to a fire that had not just taken his family, but had tried to consume him, too. Her heart constricted with an ache so profound it almost buckled her knees. It was not pity she felt, but a deep, sorrowful tenderness, a desperate wish that she could somehow turn back time and stand between him and the flames. The impulse that followed was not born of thought or reason. It came from a place deeper than that, a place of pure, instinctual connection. She stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She raised a trembling hand, and, with the lightest touch, gently traced the raised edge of a long, jagged scar that ran across his shoulder blade. His entire body went rigid. He froze, every muscle locking into place, as if he had been struck by lightning. She could feel the violent tension under her fingertips. He had lived with this ruin for years, had hidden it from the world. He would be expecting revulsion, a gasp of horror. That is what the world gave to broken things. But her touch was not one of horror. It was as soft as a falling feather, a touch that did not recoil but instead seemed to offer a quiet, reverent solace. It was a touch that said, "I see this, and I am not afraid." Slowly, as if moving against a great weight, he turned to face her. The air in the cabin grew thin, electric. All the unsaid words, all the shared pain, all the simmering, unspoken desire that had been building between them since the first night, culminated in this single, suspended moment. His startlingly clear gray eyes were no longer cold or guarded. They were blazing with a raw, vulnerable emotion that mirrored her own, a potent cocktail of fear and hope and a desperate, aching need. He raised a hand, his movement slow and deliberate. He cupped her face, his palm rough and calloused against her cheek, but the gesture itself was unbelievably gentle. His thumb stroked her skin, a tender, questioning caress. It was not the touch of a rough mountain man, but of someone cherishing a fragile, precious thing he was afraid he might break. "Elara," he breathed, and the way he said her name was everything. It was not just her name, it was a question and a prayer, a whisper of disbelief that she was really standing here, that she was real. She closed her eyes, leaning into the solid warmth of his hand, a silent surrender. This was the point of no return. She knew it, and she welcomed it. He kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a collision. It was a kiss of desperation and starvation, of two lonely souls who had forgotten the taste of comfort, finding it in the most unexpected of places. It was rough and deep and hungry, filled with all the grief and longing they had suppressed for years. It was a kiss that tasted of bitter coffee and wood smoke and the cold, clean mountain air that still clung to him. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated need, a drowning man's gasp for air. She responded with an equal, startling fervor. A fire she did not know she possessed roared to life inside her. Her hands tangled in his thick, dark hair, pulling him closer, her body pressing against his. All thoughts of who she was supposed to be, Miss Vance, the mail-order bride, the respectable woman from Ohio, dissolved in the raw, overwhelming heat of the moment, and all thoughts of who he was, the scarred recluse, the grieving widower, the town pariah, were burned away. They were just a man and a woman, finding a desperate, beautiful, and profound solace in each other's arms. That first, frantic kiss led to a deeper, more profound intimacy. They came together not with haste, but with a slow, exploratory reverence. For Elara, it was an awakening. Her body, which she had come to think of as merely a vessel for survival, a thing to be clothed and fed and transported, came alive under his touch. For Caleb, it was an act of reclamation, of rediscovering a part of himself he thought was dead and buried, a part he believed had been consumed by the same fire that took his family. It was an act of healing. They learned the landscapes of each other's bodies, the geography of his scars and the soft, uncharted territory of her skin, with a tenderness that defied the harshness of their lives. His hands, which could break a horse or swing an axe, were impossibly gentle, mapping her with a kind of wonder. And her hands, in turn, did not shy away from his damaged skin, but explored it with a sorrowful acceptance that was more healing than any salve. Afterwards, they lay entangled in the heavy furs before the fire, their limbs intertwined, the rhythm of their breathing slowly falling into sync. The wind sighed outside, a gentle, lonely sound. But for the first time in years, neither of them felt alone. The silence that settled over them was peaceful, a comfortable blanket. They began to talk again, their voices low murmurs in the firelight, sharing secrets they had never spoken aloud to another soul. He told her their names. His wife's name was Lily. His son, who had barely lived a year, was named Samuel. Saying their names to her, to this woman in his arms, felt like both a terrible betrayal and an incredible release. He was sharing his ghosts, and in doing so, he was loosening their grip on his soul. In turn, she told him about a small, secret dream she had harbored. "I always wanted a garden," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not a grand one, just a small patch of earth, to grow things, to watch them come to life." It was a simple, humble wish, one that had seemed impossibly distant, a dream from another life. The next day, they existed in a blissful, insulated bubble, suspended in time. The world outside, the world of Redemption Gulch and Mr. Thompson, did not exist. There was only the cabin, the fire, and each other. They fell into a comfortable, easy domestic rhythm. They worked together to clear the snow, their movements synchronized, their laughter echoing in the crisp, clean air. He taught her how to set a snare, and she showed him how to make a decent stew from their dwindling supplies. They were playing house, two lonely children finding a make-believe home, and for a short, precious time, they allowed themselves to believe in the reality of it. But the outside world, like the sun, cannot be held at bay forever. The snow, which had been a wall, a barrier, was now beginning to settle and melt under the strengthening sun. The path down the mountain would soon be passable, and with that thought, the reality of their situation came crashing back in. The conversation that evening was somber, the easy laughter gone. The name that had been a specter in the background now became a solid, looming presence between them. "I am afraid," Elara confessed, her voice small. She was staring into the fire, but seeing the handsome, smiling face from the photograph Mr. Thompson had sent her, the face of a stranger she was supposed to marry. "I cannot marry him. Caleb, after all this, I cannot—" Caleb's expression, which had softened over the past few days, hardened into the familiar mask of stone she had first seen. His gray eyes turned cold, but it was a different kind of coldness now, not of detachment, but of a fierce, protective anger. "You will not go to him," he said. It was not a suggestion or a promise. It was a simple, declarative statement, a vow sealed in the quiet cabin. He finally told her what his clipped, bitter words on the trail had only hinted at. "Thompson is not a good man. Elara, he owns the town, and he owns the people in it. They fear him. That respectability you read about in his letters, it is a facade. It hides a cruelty, a hunger for control that you cannot imagine." He reached out and took her hand, his grip strong and sure. "He thinks he is buying a wife, a pretty possession to show off. He does not know you. He would crush the spirit I have seen in you. I will not let that happen." His protectiveness was not born of ownership, not of a man claiming what he believed was his. It was something deeper, a genuine fear for her safety and a fierce, desperate desire to keep the light she had brought back into his life from being extinguished by the darkness that was Alistair Thompson. The decision was made, unspoken but absolute. They would face this together. Their time in the cabin, their sanctuary, was over. The journey down the mountain was no longer a trip to deliver a bride to her respectable future. It was a descent into battle. Two outcasts against a town and the man who ruled it, with nothing but a fragile, storm-forged love to shield them. The journey down from the mountain was a descent into a different world. The pristine, sun-drenched beauty that had been a backdrop for their new intimacy now seemed like a cruel joke. The snow was a dazzling, blinding white, the sky a piercing, cloudless blue, but the beauty was lost on them. A somber mood, as heavy as the storm clouds had been, enveloped them. They rode in silence, but it was not the comfortable, knowing silence of the cabin. It was the tense, watchful silence of soldiers heading into battle. The easy, unguarded intimacy they had shared was gone, packed away like a treasured, fragile thing that could not survive the harsh light of the world below. In its place was a tense, protective alliance. Caleb no longer rode ahead, a distant, solitary figure. He rode beside her, so close their knees sometimes brushed. His eyes, which had softened in the firelight, were now hard and cold again, constantly scanning their surroundings. He was not looking for the natural dangers of the trail, a patch of ice, a loose rock. He was watching with the grim, quiet anticipation of a man who knows he is riding toward a fight. Elara felt a knot of cold fear tighten in her stomach. Every plodding step of the horse brought her closer to a confrontation she could barely imagine. But the fear was different now. It was tempered by a new, steely resolve that had taken root in the mountain cabin. The woman who rode down from the snow was not the same timid, desperate creature who had ridden up into it. The frightened girl running from whispers was gone. In her place was a woman who had found something to fight for. She had found a man whose sorrow mirrored her own. And in the space between their two broken hearts, something whole and incredibly precious had begun to grow. She would not let the world crush it. Before they descended into the valley proper, Caleb reined in his horse on a high ridge. He pointed a gloved finger. There, Redemption Gulch. Elara followed his gaze, and her heart sank. The town was not the prosperous, welcoming community, mister. Thompson's letters had described. It was a raw, ugly gash carved into the valley floor. A single main street, a river of brown, churned mud, was lined with a collection of drab, false-fronted buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. A gray pall of smoke from the saloon and the blacksmith's forge hung over the town like a shroud, tainting the clean mountain air. It looked like a place that could swallow a person whole and leave no trace. That one, Caleb said, his voice flat. He indicated a house set on a small rise at the far end of the street. It was the largest building in town. A 2-story clapboard structure painted a stark, unforgiving white. It was positioned to look down on everything and everyone else, a perfect expression of its owner's place in the town's hierarchy. The sight of it, so neat and orderly and menacing, made Elara's blood run cold. That was the house she was supposed to call home. Their arrival caused an immediate and unsettling stir. As they rode down the muddy main street, it was as if a silent alarm had been sounded. Men stopped their conversations on the boardwalks to turn and stare. Women paused in their shopping, their faces hardening. Doors to homes and businesses opened a crack, revealing watchful, suspicious eyes. The ambient noise of the town, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of a passing wagon seemed to die away, leaving a silence thick with judgment. They saw it all in a single, sweeping glance. The two of them, the town's reclusive, scarred outcast, the man of mixed heritage they called Blackwood, emerging from the wilderness days after the blizzard had hit, and with him, the pristine, untouched mail-order bride who belonged to the most powerful man in town. The conclusion in the minds of the townspeople was as swift as it was damning. Whispers followed them like biting flies, too low to be understood but their meaning as clear as a pointed finger. Elara could feel the weight of their collective gaze, dissecting her, judging her clothes, her posture, her presence beside this man. Caleb's face was an unreadable mask of stone, but she was learning to read the subtle signs of the storm within him. She saw the muscle that jumped in his tightly clenched jaw, the way his hand rested, not quite touching, on the worn leather grip of the pistol holstered at his hip. He was a powder keg, holding himself in check through sheer, formidable will. Alistair Thompson was waiting for them. He stood on the raised porch of the general store as if he had been holding court, the town's unofficial king on his throne. He was everything Caleb was not. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit, his shirt a brilliant white against his tanned skin. His face was smooth and handsome, his dark hair perfectly combed. When he saw them, a smile spread across his lips, a practiced, charming expression designed to win favor and disarm enemies. But the smile did not reach his eyes. His eyes were a pale, cold blue, like chips of ice, and they held a look of possessive appraisal as they swept over Alara. He stepped forward to the edge of the porch, deliberately positioning himself above them. He addressed Alara as if Caleb were nothing more than a horse she had ridden in on. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "We were so worried. The storm was a terrible thing. I am Alistair Thompson. It seems my man has finally delivered you." His tone was proprietary, his words a clear and public dismissal of Caleb. My man. The insult was meant to sting, to remind Caleb of his place. Alara felt Caleb tense beside her. She knew she had to be the one to speak, with Caleb standing steadfastly just behind her, a silent, solid presence at her back. She found her voice. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice trembling slightly but holding firm. "There has been a misunderstanding." Thompson's smile tightened at the edges. His gaze finally shifted to Caleb, and it was dripping with a cold, undisguised contempt. "Blackwood," he said, the name an epithet. "You were paid to bring my fiancée to me, not to keep her for yourself for a week in the mountains." The accusation, crude and direct, hung in the silent air. It was designed to publicly shame them, to paint her as a fallen woman and Caleb as a savage who had taken advantage of her. A low murmur rippled through the gathered townspeople. Their worst assumptions had just been confirmed by the town leader himself. This was the moment, the public climax of their descent. Caleb did not rise to the bait. His face remained a stony mask. "The storm. Thompson," he said, his voice a low growl. "We took shelter. It is the only reason she is still alive." But Alara knew this was not a fight Caleb could win for her. It had to be her choice, her words. She looked directly at Alistair Thompson, meeting his icy gaze without flinching. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice gaining strength and clarity with every word. "I will not be your wife. I cannot marry you." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. A woman defying Alistair Thompson. It was unthinkable. Thompson's charming facade cracked. For a split second, a look of pure, predatory rage flashed in his eyes, so venomous it made her recoil. It was the face of the man Caleb had warned her about, the monster beneath the fine suit. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, masked by a cold, humorless laugh. "My dear girl, you are overwrought," he said, his tone condescending, as if speaking to a hysterical child. "The ordeal has confused you. You are not thinking clearly. Come, my housekeeper will get you settled in, and we can forget this unfortunate episode." He started down the steps of the porch, reaching for her arm. Caleb moved. It was not a fast movement, but it was absolute. He shifted his position, placing his body squarely between Alara and Thompson's outstretched hand. He did not draw his weapon. He did not need to. His sheer, unmovable presence was threat enough. The message was clear. You will not touch her. "She said no," Caleb said, and his voice was a low, dangerous growl that cut through the murmurs and silenced the crowd completely. The confrontation was electric. The handsome, civilized town boss and the scarred, silent outcast, facing each other over a woman in the muddy main street. Thompson, unused to being defied in any capacity, let alone so publicly, felt his control snap. His face turned a blotchy, furious red. The pretense of charm vanished entirely. "You will regret this, Blackwood," he spat, his voice shaking with rage. He then turned his venom on Alara. "And you, madam," he sneered, the word an insult, "will find that this town has very little patience for your kind. You have made a powerful enemy today." He turned on his heel and stormed back up the steps and into the general store, slamming the door behind him. The crowd, which had been a ring of silent witnesses, parted before him as if he were a leper. The immediate aftermath was devastating. The show was over, and the verdict had been rendered. The townspeople, who took their cues from Thompson as surely as sunflowers turn to the sun, turned their backs on them. It was a silent, universal shunning. Men who had been staring now found the mud on their boots fascinating. Women gathered their skirts and hurried away, some pulling their children closer as if Alara and Caleb carried a contagious disease. Caleb, his face grim, led her toward the general store. They needed supplies. The owner, a man who had been watching the entire exchange from his doorway, met them with a hard, flat expression. "I have got nothing for you, Blackwood," he said, blocking the entrance. "And I will not serve her, neither." Cale's hand twitched near his gun, but he held himself back. He turned without a word and led Alara toward the town's only hotel. The proprietor, a small, nervous man, came out onto the porch, wringing his hands. "No vacant rooms," he said quickly, before they could even ask. None at all. They were utterly, completely ostracized. The social prejudice was a palpable force, pressing in on them from all sides. As they walked back toward the horses, the whispers were no longer cautious. They were louder now, edged with malice. She heard the muttered insults, words meant to wound. "Savage! Whore!" For the first time, Alara truly understood the full, crushing weight of the hatred that Caleb had lived with his entire life. It was a poison in the air, a constant, grinding assault on a man's soul. The pain of it was sharp, a physical blow to her heart. But as the pain subsided, it left something hard and unyielding in its place. It solidified her resolve. She had made her choice on that mountain. She had chosen this man, with all his scars, visible and invisible. She had chosen him over a comfortable life built on lies. She would not regret it. With nowhere else to go, Caleb helped her onto her horse. "My place is a few miles out," he said, his voice low and strained. "It is not much, but it is safe." They rode out of Redemption Gulch, leaving the hostile stares and poisoned whispers behind them. Caleb led her to his ranch, the one he was rebuilding on the ashes of his old life. It was a small, functional cabin, much like the one in the mountains, built of new pale logs that had not yet weathered to gray. Nearby were the beginnings of a new barn and a corral. In the distance, a patch of blackened earth and a solitary stone chimney stood as a stark monument to the life that had been burned away. It was a place of painful memories, but it was also a powerful symbol of his resilience. He was a man who had been burned to the ground and was stubbornly, painstakingly, building himself back up. As they dismounted in the quiet yard, the full weight of their decision settled upon them. They had openly defied the most powerful man in the territory. They had made themselves pariahs. The fight for survival was no longer against the cold and the wind. It was against the hatred of their fellow men, a storm far more dangerous and unpredictable than any blizzard. That night, in the quiet of his new home, he built a fire in the hearth. The small cabin was filled with the scent of fresh-cut pine and wood smoke. The ghosts of his past were there, silent and watchful. But they made room for her. He gave her the only bunk, just as he had before. But this time, when he laid his furs on the floor, he laid them close to her bed. In the flickering light, she reached a hand down to him. He took it, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. Their love, born in the desperate darkness of a mountain storm, was now their only shelter against the new one that was brewing in Redemption Gulch. They did not need to speak. In the firm, steady grip of their joined hands, they made a quiet vow to face it all, together. It was a moment of profound love and unwavering commitment in the face of absolute social ruin. The weeks that followed their return from the mountain became a slow, grinding war of attrition. Alistair Thompson did not need to use a gun to try to destroy them. He had more subtle and effective weapons at his disposal. He began to strangle their life with the invisible threads of his influence, pulling them tight until they could barely breathe. For Caleb, the assault was direct and crippling. He rode into town to re-establish his credit at the general store, only to be told flatly that his account was closed. When he tried to pay with cash, the prices for simple goods like flour and salt had mysteriously doubled. The freight company in the next county suddenly lost a shipment of new tools he had ordered months before. A new saw, a good axe, nails to finish the barn. The loss was a significant blow, setting his work back by months. He tried to sell a few head of his small cattle herd to raise funds, but the buyers who came out to his ranch, all friends of Thompson, looked over his healthy stock with practiced disinterest and made insultingly low offers, their eyes holding a glint of cruel satisfaction. Every attempt he made to build their life, to claw his way back from the ashes, was met with a new, invisible wall. Ilara faced her own quiet, daily battle. Her war was fought in the cold shoulders and averted eyes of the women of Redemption Gulch. On the rare occasions, she had to venture into town for a spool of thread or a bar of soap. A chilling silence would fall as she entered a shop. Women would gather their skirts and move to the other side of the room, pulling their children away as if she carried a virulent disease. The whispers were a constant presence, a cloud of biting insects that followed her down the muddy street. She was the fallen woman, the harlot who had bewitched the town's half-savage recluse and spurned its most respectable citizen. She was an outcast, a pariah, and the town took a grim pleasure in reminding her of it at every turn. They were utterly, completely isolated, an island of two in a sea of hostility, but the pressure, which was meant to break them apart, instead forged their bond into something stronger than steel. The hardship stripped away everything that was not essential, leaving only the bedrock of their reliance on each other. They were no longer just a man and a woman in love. They were partners in a desperate daily struggle for survival. Caleb, seeing the hard road ahead, began to teach her the skills she would need to survive it. He took her out into the rugged hills behind the ranch and taught her how to handle a rifle, its weight solid and unfamiliar in her arms. He was a patient teacher, his rough hands gentle as he corrected her stance, his voice a low rumble as he taught her to control her breathing. He taught her how to read the subtle language of the land, how to identify animal tracks, how to find water, which plants were medicine and which were poison. He was giving her the tools of his world, making her a part of it, and she, in turn, learned with a fierce determination. While he gave her the skills of the wilderness, she brought a different kind of life to his stark, silent home. His new cabin, like the one in the mountains, was a place of function, not comfort. She began to change that in small, quiet ways. She scrubbed the floors until the pale wood gleamed. She found a patch of viable soil near the cabin, and with seeds she had carefully packed in her trunk, she planted a small, stubborn garden. She tilled the hard, rocky earth with a spade, her hands growing calloused, and planted rows of beans, squash, and a few precious herbs. That little patch of green was a defiant act of hope, a declaration that they intended to put down roots in this hostile ground. It was her answer to the town's hatred. Their moments of intimacy, which had been born of desperate solace, were now colored with a fierce, protective passion. In the quiet darkness of the cabin, with the hostile world held at bay, they found not just comfort but strength in each other's arms. They were a refuge for one another, their shared bed the only place they could let down their guard and be vulnerable. The dark tragedies of their pasts were a constant undercurrent, the ghosts that shared their small home. Caleb still had nightmares. Ilara would often wake in the night to find him gone from their bed, only to see his silhouette standing out by the lone stone chimney, a dark, silent sentinel staring at the spot where his first house and his whole world had burned. She, too, had dreams of smoke and accusation, waking with the imagined scent of soot in her nostrils and the remembered sting of her neighbor's judging eyes. In these moments, they would hold each other, their shared trauma, a bond that bound them as tightly as their love. He would stroke her hair until her trembling subsided, and she would hold his hand, her small grip a silent anchor against the pull of his grief. Just when their isolation felt absolute, a glimmer of hope appeared from the most unexpected quarter. Her name was Sarah Miller, the elderly widow of the town's former doctor. Dr. Miller had passed away the previous winter, leaving Sarah alone in a small house on the very edge of town. As much of an outsider in her own way as they were, she was a woman who valued kindness and character over social standing and the pronouncements of men like Alistair Thompson. One afternoon, Elara was on her knees in her small garden, pulling weeds, when she saw a figure approaching on foot from the direction of town. Her first instinct was to run inside, her stomach clenching with the familiar dread of another confrontation. But the woman, who was small and stooped with age, carried a basket and walked with a slow, unthreatening gait. It was Sarah. She stopped at the edge of the garden, her face a fine web of wrinkles, holding a look of gentle compassion. "I brought you some fresh bread," she said, her voice thin but clear. "And a bit of my husband's old tonic, good for aches and pains." Elara was so stunned by the simple act of kindness that she could not speak. Sarah quietly set the basket down and looked at the small, struggling plants. "My, that is a brave bit of green in this hard soil," she said with an appreciative nod. That visit was the first of many. Once a week, Sarah would make the long walk out to the ranch, her basket always containing some small offering, a jar of preserves, a few eggs from her chickens, a bundle of herbs. She would sit with Elara for an hour, and they would talk. She offered Elara a few precious moments of female companionship, a lifeline in her sea of isolation. Sarah had known Caleb's first wife, Lily, and she spoke of her with a genuine, uncomplicated affection that warmed Elara's heart. "A lovely girl," Sarah would say, her eyes distant with memory, full of life, and she loved Caleb something fierce, did not care what anyone, especially her brother, had to say about it. It was through Sarah, on a late summer evening as the sun bled across the western sky, that the central tragedy of Caleb's life began to unravel. Sarah had been quiet that day, her usual gentle chatter replaced by a troubled silence. As she prepared to leave, she took Elara's hand, her papery skin cool to the touch. "There is something that has weighed on my conscience for a long time. Dear," she began, her gaze fixed on the stone chimney in the distance. "Something my husband, the doctor, told me before he passed." Elara waited, a sense of foreboding prickling her skin. "You know Lily was Alistair Thompson's sister, do you not?" Sarah asked softly. Elara shook her head, stunned. Caleb had never mentioned it. The fact that his lost wife was the sister of his greatest enemy was a shocking revelation. "Oh yes," Sarah continued, her voice low. "His younger sister. He was always fiercely possessive of her, even when they were children. When she fell in love with Caleb, Alistair was furious. He could not stand the thought of his sister marrying a man like Caleb, a man he saw as beneath them, a half-breed who would sully the family's bloodline. He made threats. He forbade her from seeing him, but Lily had a strong will. She defied him and married Caleb anyway. Alistair all but disowned her after that. He refused to speak her name." Sarah paused, taking a deep, shaky breath before delivering the final, devastating blow. "On the night of the fire," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "My husband was called out late, not here, to Alistair Thompson's house. Thompson had a severe, fresh burn on his forearm. He claimed it was a lantern accident, that he had knocked one over in his study. But my husband, he was a doctor for 40 years. He knew the look of different burns. He said it did not look right, and he said Thompson was not acting like a man who had a simple accident. He was agitated, angry, and his clothes smelled faintly of smoke. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. "My husband died with this secret," Sarah said, her eyes filling with tears. "But he always suspected. Ilara, he believed Alistair had come out here that night. He believed he had come to confront Lily, to try one last time to force her to leave Caleb. And he believed that their argument, that it escalated, that somehow Alistair was the cause of the fire." The words hung in the quiet evening air, a revelation so monstrous it seemed to suck the very breath from the sky. When Sarah had gone, Ilara stood frozen, the old woman's story echoing in her mind. She thought of Caleb, of the years of crushing guilt he had carried. He had told her once, in a moment of raw grief, that he blamed himself. He believed that in his frantic haste to get his wife and son out of the burning house, he had knocked over a lantern, spreading the flames and sealing their fate. He had carried the weight of their deaths on his shoulders every single day. The idea that Thompson was not only present, but potentially responsible, was a bombshell that would shatter the foundations of his world. When Caleb came in from the barn, he knew instantly that something was wrong. She was sitting at the table, her face pale as bone, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and grief. He knelt before her, his hands taking hers. "Ilara, what is it?" Her voice was a choked whisper as she relayed Sarah's story. She told him every detail, every suspicion, every terrible word. As he listened, his face underwent a terrifying transformation. The warmth she had brought back into his life was extinguished, his eyes turning from warm gray to chips of flint. The lines of grief that were etched around his mouth and eyes hardened into something else, something cold and deadly. His grief, which had slowly, painstakingly begun to heal through his love for her, was ripped open, raw and bleeding, and into that gaping wound poured a volcanic, white-hot rage. He did not explode. He did not yell or curse or break something. He did something far more frightening. He retreated into a chilling, dangerous silence. He stood up, his movement stiff and deliberate. He pulled away from her touch and walked to the pegs by the door where his gun belt hung. He strapped it around his waist, his fingers moving with a calm, methodical deadliness. He did not look at her. His face was a mask of death. "Caleb, no," she whispered, scrambling to her feet. "What are you doing?" "He let me believe it was my fault," he said, his voice a low, terrifying monotone, devoid of all emotion. "For all these years, he stood in town and watched me suffer, knowing it was him." He walked out the door toward the corral where his horse was tethered. Ilara ran after him, her heart pounding with a terror that eclipsed anything she had ever felt. He was moving like a man in a trance, a sleepwalker on a path to damnation. He threw a saddle on his horse, his movements brutally efficient. He was going to ride into town and kill Alistair Thompson. She knew it with an absolute, bone-deep certainty. She had to stop him. As he put his foot in the stirrup, she launched herself forward, standing between him and his horse, her small body a desperate, trembling barrier. "Caleb, please, do not do this!" He looked down at her, but his eyes did not seem to see her. They were looking through her, at the face of the man who had destroyed his life. "Get out of my way, Ilara!" "No!" she cried, her hands flat against his chest, trying to hold back an avalanche. "Listen to me. If you do this, he wins. He will have taken everything. They will hang you. Caleb, you will be a murderer in their eyes, and it will not matter what he did. It will not bring Lily and Samuel back." The names of his wife and son, spoken aloud, caused a flicker of something in his dead eyes, a spasm of pain. She pressed on, her words tumbling out in a frantic, pleading torrent. "He took your past from you. He filled it with guilt and pain and left you with nothing but ashes. I know that, but we have a future. You and I. It is a hard future, and it might be a poor one, but it is ours. Do not let him take that from us. Too, please, Caleb, I am begging you, do not let him take our future." Her words, her love, Her fierce, desperate refusal to lose him were the only things on earth that could have pierced the thick wall of his grief and rage. He stared down at her, his face contorting, the mask of ice beginning to crack. His whole body began to tremble, a violent, seismic shudder. And then he broke. For the first time since she had met him, he broke completely. It was not the quiet, solitary grief she had witnessed before. It was a storm, an agonizing, soul-tearing tempest of sobs that ripped through his body. A sound of such profound and absolute devastation rose from his throat that it seemed to shake the very ground they stood on. He collapsed against her, his huge frame shuddering, his face buried in her hair, and he wept. He wept for his wife, for his son, for the years of stolen life and misplaced guilt, for a pain so immense it could only be expressed in this raw, elemental outpouring. Ilara wrapped her arms around him, holding him as he had held her in her nightmares, her own tears streaming down her face. It was a moment of complete emotional ruin, but in that ruin, there was a glimmer of catharsis. The poison of his silent rage was being purged. When the storm finally subsided, he was left limp and exhausted in her arms. They both knew she was right. They could not win with violence. That was Thompson's way. They had to find another way. They needed more than Sarah's story. They needed proof. Their goal, forged in that moment of shared devastation and resolve, was no longer just survival. And it was no longer just revenge. It was justice. The aftermath of Caleb's breakdown marked a profound shift in their struggle. The raw, desperate fight for simple survival gave way to a tense, dangerous quest for justice. They were no longer just defending their right to exist. They were actively seeking to dismantle the lie that had defined Caleb's life and poisoned the town. They both knew that Sarah's story, as much as they believed it in their bones, was just that, a story. It was the word of a dead man, recounted by his grieving widow. Against a man like Alistair Thompson, it was worth less than the dust on their boots. They needed something concrete, something undeniable that could corroborate the doctor's suspicion. Their focus turned to a quiet, methodical search for anything that could expose Thompson for the monster he was. This new mission required them to be clever and strategic, to operate in the shadows of a town where every eye was hostile. Their investigation began with a name from Caleb's past, a man named Silas. Caleb remembered him as an old, down-on-his-luck ranch hand who had worked for Thompson for years, a man who was fond of the bottle but was generally harmless. Caleb also remembered that Silas had been abruptly dismissed just a few weeks after the fire. The timing had always seemed odd. They found him living in a miserable, dilapidated shack miles from town, a place that reeked of stale whiskey and regret. Their approach was slow and careful. They did not come with questions at first. They came with offerings. Caleb brought a sack of flour and some salted pork. Ilara brought a fresh loaf of bread she had baked and a bottle of decent whiskey, a commodity Silas clearly could not afford. They sat with him, not pressing, just sharing a quiet moment. It was Ilara's gentle, empathetic presence that finally broke through his wall of shame. She did not judge him for the state of his home or the tremor in his hands. She simply treated him like a man. After several such visits, Silas, his tongue loosened by whiskey and his conscience racked with a guilt he had carried for years, finally began to talk. His confession came in a torrent of slurred, broken words. He admitted that on the night of the fire, Thompson had ordered him to hitch up a buggy. The official reason was to check on some stray cattle on the North Range, a flimsy excuse for a late-night ride. The real reason, Silas knew, was Lily. Thompson had been in a towering, silent rage all day, a cold fury that was far more terrifying than his usual shouting. He had been muttering about his sister, about the shame she had brought on their name. Silas had driven Thompson out to the edge of Caleb's property and had been ordered to wait. He waited for hours in the dark, the wind cold and restless. When Thompson finally returned, he was a different man. The cold rage was gone, replaced by a wild, agitated energy. He smelled of smoke. His fine coat was singed at the cuff, and when he climbed back into the buggy, Silas saw a fresh, angry burn on his forearm. Thompson had said nothing on the ride back, but before dismissing him, he had grabbed Silas by the shirt front, his eyes blazing with a maniacal light. He had threatened to kill Silas, to bury him in an unmarked grave where no one would ever find him, if he ever spoke a single word of what he had seen that night. Armed with Silas's potential testimony, they had a witness, but it was still one man's word against Thompson's. They needed something more tangible. It was Alara who remembered something Sarah had mentioned in passing, that Lily had been a devoted diarist, always scribbling in a little leather-bound book. She also recalled Sarah saying that Thompson, as Lily's next of kin, had come to collect the few of her belongings that had survived the fire, a small box of trinkets that had been in a fire-resistant safe. The theory formed between them, a dangerous and desperate hope. What if the diary was in that box? What if Thompson, in his arrogance, had kept it, perhaps as a sick trophy of his victory, or perhaps because in his haste, he had simply overlooked its significance? The plan that grew from this theory was incredibly risky, a gamble with their very lives. Alara would have to get inside Thompson's house. They devised a plan that hinged on the town's most cherished annual event, the Founders' Day Picnic. It was the one day of the year when the entire population of Redemption Gulch, including Alistair Thompson, would be gathered in the meadow by the creek, preoccupied with speeches, three-legged races, and communal feasting. While the town was distracted, Alara would slip into his house to ensure Thompson and the rest of the town remained occupied. Caleb would create a diversion on the far side of town, a small, carefully controlled grass fire. It would be just enough to look alarming, to draw the town's small volunteer fire brigade away from the main celebration and hold their attention. The tension in the days leading up to the picnic was immense. A taut wire stretched to its breaking point. They spoke little, their minds consumed with the details and the dangers of their plan. They both knew that if they were caught, the consequences would be absolute. Caleb would be accused of arson and horse theft, and a hanging would be swift. Alara's fate, as a thief and a woman who had scorned Thompson, would be just as grim. Their farewell on the morning of Founders' Day, as they prepared to part ways, was heavy with unspoken fear. Caleb held her face in his hands, his gray eyes searching hers. "If anything goes wrong," he said, his voice thick, "you run. You take your horse and you do not look back. Do you understand?" She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He kissed her then, a desperate, loving kiss that tasted of fear and forever. It could be their last. The plan unfolded with a terrifying precision. From a wooded ridge, they watched the townspeople gather in the meadow. When the time was right, Caleb rode off. A short while later, a plume of thick, dark smoke began to rise from the dry hills to the east of town. A cry of "Fire!" went up from the picnic grounds. Men started running, shouting for buckets. The distraction was working. Alara, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird, slipped down into the now quiet town. Thompson's white house stood silent and imposing on its small hill, with the tool Caleb had given her. She worked at the lock on the back door, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline. The lock clicked open, and she slipped inside, into the pristine, sterile home of the man who had destroyed their lives. The search was a frantic, nerve-shredding race against time. She moved through the house, which was as cold and perfectly ordered as its owner. Nothing was out of place. She looked through his office, rifling through the papers on his desk, and then his study, her eyes scanning the titles on his bookshelves. Nothing. Her hope began to dwindle. Finally, she entered his bedroom. It was as impersonal as a hotel room. In the back of a large, dark wood wardrobe, she found it, a small, locked metal box with no key. She used the fireplace poker to pry the lock open. The screech of metal was deafening in the silent house. Inside, nestled among a few pieces of jewelry, was a small, leather-bound diary, and beside it, a small, singed silver locket. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She opened it. Inside was a tiny, perfect portrait of a much younger Caleb, smiling and unscarred. With trembling fingers, she opened the diary. The final pages were filled with Lily's elegant, flowing script, which grew more hurried and agitated as she wrote. The last entry was a heartbreaking, terrified scrawl. "Alistair is here. He rode in like a thundercloud. He is mad. He says I have shamed our family, that I must leave Caleb and the baby and come home. I told him I never would. He says if he cannot have me, no one will." A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Ilara's blood turned to ice. She looked up to see Alistair Thompson standing in the doorway, his handsome face contorted into a mask of pure fury. He must have grown suspicious of the fire's convenient timing, of the way it had pulled everyone away from town. He saw the open box in her hands, the diary, the locket. The mask of civility he wore for the world was gone forever, replaced by the face of a true monster. "So the little sneak has been busy," he hissed, advancing into the room. "You should have taken my offer, you foolish girl. You could have had everything." "You killed them," she whispered, clutching the diary to her chest. He laughed, a chilling, triumphant sound. "She was my sister. She belonged to me. He tainted her, and I let him live with the guilt. I watched him rot from the inside out for years. It was the most perfect revenge I could have imagined." He was gloating, confessing everything, his arrogance making him reckless. He took another step toward her, his eyes glittering with a murderous light. "And now, I am afraid you have seen too much." He lunged for her, intending to silence her for good. At that exact, critical moment, the window of the bedroom exploded inward in a shower of glass. Caleb, his face a mask of primal fury, crashed into the room. He had seen Thompson leave the picnic, had doubled back, his heart pounding with a terrible premonition. The final fight was not a glorious Western shootout. It was a brutal, desperate, and ugly brawl. The two men crashed into each other, their fight a whirlwind of desperate, killing rage. They smashed furniture, their grunts and the sickening thud of their fists echoing through the silent house. Thompson was strong, but Caleb was fueled by years of grief and a righteous fury that gave him the strength of 10 men. The sounds of the struggle, the breaking glass, the splintering wood, the raw shouts of men drew the attention of the sheriff and several other men who were returning from the fire. They burst into the house and up the stairs to find a scene of chaos. Thompson, his face a bloody mess, trying to kill Ilara, who was scrambling away from him. Caleb, a savage look in his eyes, defending her, and the open diary lying on the floor amid the wreckage. "It was him!" Ilara screamed, holding up the singed silver locket for all to see. "He killed his sister and her child! He set the fire!" The sheriff, a man named Brody, who had always disliked Caleb but was, at his core, a fundamentally decent man, looked from the scene of violence to the diary on the floor. He picked it up, in a clear, loud voice that cut through the panting breaths of the two fighters. He read the last, damning entry aloud. As if on cue, a figure appeared in the doorway behind the sheriff. It was Silas, whom Caleb had brought to the edge of town and told to wait. His face was pale, but his eyes were sober and clear. "It is the truth," Silas said, his voice shaking but firm. "I drove him there that night. I saw the burn on his arm. The tide of public opinion, so long a crushing force against them, finally, irrevocably turned." The looks on the faces of the men in the room shifted from suspicion to dawning, horrified comprehension. They were looking at Caleb and Ilara, and then at their esteemed town leader, as if seeing them all for the first time. The aftermath was swift. Thompson, sputtering denials and threats, was taken into custody. The town of Redemption Gulch was forced to confront the ugly truth about the man it had allowed to rule it, and in doing so, to confront its own deep-seated prejudice. Justice was served, but it was a somber victory. It could not bring back the dead. It could not erase the years of pain and guilt that Caleb had endured. The story did not end with the town suddenly embracing Caleb and Alara as heroes. Prejudice does not die overnight. There were still whispers, still averted eyes. But the open hostility was gone, replaced by a grudging, reluctant respect. It ended, instead, with a quiet, hard-won peace. Weeks later, they stood on the porch of their small cabin, looking out at the vast, wild landscape that had first thrown them together. The scars of their pasts remained, a part of who they were, but they were no longer defined by them. They had survived the fire, they had survived the storm, and they had survived the hatred of men. They had each other. Alara turned and placed her hand on Caleb's chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her palm. Their love, a fragile seed planted in the desperate darkness of a mountain cabin, had been tested by the harshest winds imaginable, and it had not only survived, it had grown into something strong and resilient, a defiant glimmer of hope in the unforgiving West. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the campfire. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. And please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.